New York City, the city of endless possibilities and hidden history. The city of Wall Street. Broadway, where the lights never dim and the stories never end. Skyscrapers, billion-dollar apartments. The United Nations, the city where 1 square foot of land can cost more than a car. Now imagine someone telling you that all of this, Manhattan, the heart of New York City, was once bought for almost nothing. Not millions, not thousands, but supposedly $24. That is the story many of us grew up hearing. A Dutch man arrives in 1626, meets Native Americans, gives them some beads and trinkets, and somehow walks away with the most valuable island in the world. It sounds like the greatest real estate deal in history. But here's the problem. That version is not exactly true. And the real story is much more interesting. Because Manhattan was not bought with $24 in cash, the people involved may not have understood the deal in the same way. The people who accepted the trade may not have controlled the entire island. And the Dutch were not simply buying land. They were buying a legal excuse to build an empire. So today, we're going to break down the myth, the real deal, and how a small island called Manhattan became New York City. Let's start with the famous story. In 1626, a Dutch official named Peter Minuit is said to have purchased Manhattan Island from native people for goods worth 60 Dutch guilders. Later, that number was converted into the famous $24, and over time, the story became almost cartoonish. People imagined a group of Europeans showing up with shiny beads, tricking Native Americans, and taking one of the most valuable pieces of land on Earth. It became a symbol of the ultimate bargain. But history is rarely that simple. The first important thing to understand is this. $24 is not the original number. The original number was 60 guilders, and it came from a letter written in 1626 by a Dutch official named Peter Schagen. That letter said the Dutch had purchased the island of Manhattan for goods valued at 60 guilders. Not cash, not dollars, goods. And remember, the United States did not even exist in 1626. So saying Manhattan was bought for $24 is already a modern translation of an old Dutch value. It is catchy, it is easy to remember, but it is also misleading. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to the early 1600s. At that time, New York was not New York. It was part of a Dutch colony called New Netherland. The Dutch were not mainly trying to build a giant city at first. They were trying to make money, and one of the biggest businesses was the fur trade. Beaver pelts were extremely valuable in Europe. They were used to make fashionable hats, so the Dutch West India Company wanted control over trade routes, rivers, ports, and relationships with native communities. Manhattan was perfect for this. It sat at the mouth of a huge river system. Ships could enter from the Atlantic, traders could move north through the Hudson River, goods could move in and out. In other words, Manhattan was not valuable because it had skyscrapers, it was valuable because of geography. It was a doorway, a trading hub, a military position, a business opportunity. And the Dutch knew that if they wanted to secure their colony, they needed a permanent base. That base became New Amsterdam, the settlement that later became New York City. Now let's talk about Peter Minuit. Peter Minuit was sent by the Dutch West India Company to help manage New Netherland. His job was not romantic. He was not some explorer wandering around for adventure. He was a company man. He worked for a corporation, and that corporation wanted profit, land claims, trade, and legal security. This is very important. Because the Dutch were competing with other European powers, the English were nearby. The French were active in North America. The Spanish had already built huge colonial systems. So if the Dutch wanted to hold Manhattan, they needed more than just people living there. They needed a claim, a document, a story they could tell back in Europe. We acquired this land properly. So when the Dutch made a deal for Manhattan, it was not just a simple purchase. It was a legal performance. It told European rivals, this island is ours. We paid for it. We have the right to build here. But here is where the story becomes complicated. Who did the Dutch actually buy Manhattan from? The simple version says the Lenape, but the reality is more complex. The Lenape were the indigenous people connected to this region, but there were different groups, communities, and relationships across the area. Some historians believe the Dutch may have made the deal with Canarsie people from what is now Brooklyn. And here's the problem. They may not have controlled all of Manhattan. Some parts of Manhattan were connected to other native groups, including people often identified with the Wekwaskik. So imagine this. You are trying to buy a house. You pay someone, they smile, accept the payment, and walk away. But later you discover they did not fully own the house. That is one way historians explain the confusion. Now, we have to be careful here. We do not have a full surviving deed that explains every detail of the transaction. We do not have a perfect transcript of the conversation. We do not know exactly what each side believed in that moment, but we do know this. The Dutch and the native people likely had very different ideas about land. For Europeans, land could be owned permanently. You could buy it, sell it, fence it, transfer it, write it down in a document, then claim exclusive control. But many native communities understood land differently. Land was connected to use, relationship, season, community, hunting, farming, fishing, and movement. A deal might mean you can use this area, you can settle here, we can trade, we can share access, we can form a relationship. It did not necessarily mean we are selling this land forever and our descendants will have no claim to it. That difference is the heart of the story. Because the Dutch thought they were buying ownership, the native people may have understood the exchange as permission, alliance, trade, or shared use. Two sides could shake hands on the same deal and walk away believing two very different things had happened. This is why the $24 story is so dangerous. It makes the whole thing sound like a clever bargain, like the Dutch were smart and the native people were foolish. But that is not the real lesson. The real story is not about stupidity. It is about power. It is about translation. It is about two legal worlds colliding, and then one world using guns, disease, documents, and empire to overpower the other. Because after the so-called purchase, native people did not simply disappear because they made a bad business deal. They were gradually pushed out. Their land was taken. Their communities were broken apart. Their presence was erased from the story of the city that rose on top of their homeland. And that is why the myth needs to be corrected. Not to make the story less interesting, but to make it more honest. After the 1626 transaction, the Dutch continued building New Amsterdam. At first, it was small. Very small. Not the giant city we know today. It was a rough colonial settlement near the southern tip of Manhattan. There was a fort, a few roads, a church, warehouses, trading posts, wooden houses, animals, mud, disease, conflict, and people from many backgrounds. Dutch settlers, Walloon families, enslaved Africans, native traders, sailors, merchants, soldiers. New Amsterdam was not yet New York. It was a messy, strategic trading town. But it had something that mattered more than beauty: location. It was sitting on one of the best natural harbors in the world, and that one advantage changed everything. Over time, the Dutch settlement grew. Streets formed, trade expanded, ships arrived. Fort Amsterdam became the center of colonial power. A wall was built across the northern edge of the settlement. That wall eventually gave us the name Wall Street. Yes, the same Wall Street that later became the symbol of global finance began as a defensive boundary in a small colonial town. That is the strange magic of New York history. Every modern landmark is sitting on top of an older story. Broadway follows an older native trail. Wall Street remembers a wall. Manhattan itself carries an indigenous name. And beneath the glass towers, stock exchanges, subway lines, and luxury apartments, there is still an older map. A map of rivers, forests, villages, trails, trade routes, and people who were there first. But the Dutch did not keep Manhattan forever. In 1664, the English arrived with warships. New Amsterdam was not heavily defended. The English took control, and they renamed it New York, after the Duke of York. Just like that, New Amsterdam became New York. So think about the irony. The Dutch supposedly made the greatest real estate deal in history, and then lost the city to the English less than 40 years later. The name changed, the rulers changed, the colony changed, but the importance of Manhattan only grew. Its harbor made it a trading center. Its location made it a gateway. Its growth made it a magnet for immigrants, money, business, culture, and power. And centuries later, the island that was supposedly bought for almost nothing became one of the most expensive places on Earth. This is why the story is so fascinating. Because if you look at Manhattan today, the numbers feel impossible. Tiny apartments can cost millions. Office towers are worth billions. Land is so valuable that buildings stretch upward because there is nowhere else to go. And yet the origin story people remember is, it was bought for $24. That contrast is what makes the myth unforgettable. But the real question is not, how did the Dutch get such a good deal? The real question is, how did a trade agreement become a foundation myth for an empire? Because the $24 story does something very convenient. It turns colonization into a funny business anecdote. It makes dispossession sound like a clever transaction. It turns a painful history into a real estate joke. And that is why it survived. Because it is easier to tell the story of a bargain than the story of a people being pushed out of their homeland. Before Manhattan was Manhattan, it was part of a living indigenous world. The Lenape and related native communities knew the rivers, forests, seasons, animals, and trade paths. They had names for places. They had relationships with the land. They were not background characters waiting for Europeans to arrive. They were the original people of the region. And today, Lenape descendants are still here. Many were forced away from their ancestral lands, but their history did not vanish. Their language, culture, memory, and political presence continue. So when we talk about New York being bought, we need to remember, this was not an empty island. It was not free land. It was not a simple handshake between equal parties. It was the beginning of a colonial transformation that would reshape the lives of native people for centuries. So what really happened? Here's the clearest version. In 1626, the Dutch reported that they had acquired Manhattan for trade goods worth 60 guilders. That later became the famous $24 story. But the deal was not a modern real estate purchase. The exact native group involved is still debated. The sellers may not have controlled the entire island. The Dutch and native people likely understood land rights differently, and the transaction became useful because it helped the Dutch justify their settlement to other Europeans. So was Manhattan bought for almost nothing? Financially, compared to modern New York, yes, the number sounds absurdly small. But historically, the phrase hides more than it reveals. Because the true cost was not 60 guilders. The true cost was displacement, broken agreements, colonial expansion, cultural erasure, and generations of native people being pushed out of the story of their own land. So the next time someone says, New York was bought for $24, the best response is, yes, but not really. It was not $24 in cash. It was not a simple sale. It was not a harmless bargain. It was a misunderstanding, a legal maneuver, and a colonial claim all wrapped into one famous myth. And maybe that is why the story still matters. Because New York is not just a city of skyscrapers. It is a city built on layers. Lenape land, Dutch ambition, English conquest, immigrant labor, financial power, cultural reinvention. Every street has a memory under it. Every name has a history behind it. And Manhattan, the island people say was bought for almost nothing, became priceless. Not because of one deal in 1626, but because of centuries of people, power, trade, conflict, and ambition layered on top of each other. That is the real story of how New York was bought. Not the greatest bargain in history, but one of the most misunderstood origin stories in the world. If you learned something valuable from this episode, hit the like button. And if you want more deep dives on history, power, business, and the stories behind famous myths, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one. New York was not bought for $24. It was built on a much deeper story.